In this video, we will be replacing the front brake pads for this 2008 Hyundai Elantra. We are changing the brake pads because there is about 77,000 miles on the vehicle, and these are the original brake pads with the vehicle. Before getting started, I'm going to place wheel chocks behind each of the rear tires. And I'm also going to put on the emergency brake. Next, I'm going to jack up the front end of the vehicle just until the tires are about 1 inch off the ground. The front tires should rotate freely, and then safety stands need to be put in the correct locations. And then we can remove our wheel. When you loosen the lug nuts, it is important that you do so in a star-shaped pattern rather than loosening them around in a circle. As we take a look behind the wheel, we can see that our rotor is clearly visible. That is the disc that sits behind the wheel. We can see our caliper housing assembly, which contains our brake pad components. If we take a look at the back side of our caliper housing assembly, we can see several things of importance. First off, there is a view hole, which allows us to take a quick glimpse at the brake pads and make a rough determination as to how much is left on the brake pads. This one shows that there may be about 40% left, as the thickness of the brake pad is slightly thinner than the backing plate. Typically, if the braking pad is the same size as the backing plate, you have about 50% left. From the back side of our caliper housing assembly, we can also see our caliper pin bolts. These 2 bolts will be removed and will give us access to our brake pads. Before you get started, it is always a good idea to place a drip pan below your brake components. I'm going to be using AMSOIL's metal protector, which acts as a penetrating oil, and I'm going to apply just a little bit to the brake caliper pins. This will help break free the bolts. These bolts have been on there for almost 10 years, and they're probably somewhat corroded. After AMSOIL's metal protector has soaked in for a few minutes, I'm going to use a 14mm socket to loosen up both of the caliper bolts, and those can then be removed. And then we should be able to pivot that caliper off. Now, right now we have our caliper assembly loose. It is still connected by our brake line, and we want to be very careful that we don't damage the brake line. What I like to do is take a metal coat hanger and hang that caliper in position just as a secondary measure so it doesn't fall off and put additional strain on that brake hose. Now that our caliper has been removed, we can clearly see our brake pads that were hiding underneath that caliper. If we take another look at the pad material itself, we can see that the pad material on the outside is quite a bit thinner than the backing plate itself. This indicates to me that there may only be about 25% left on these brakes. We should be able to wiggle those brake pads out. And I'm also going to remove the brake hardware. We may be reusing this or we may be replacing it. We'll have to take a look. Now, depending on the rotor thickness, we are either going to have these rotors turned down or we're going to replace the rotors completely if they're already too thin. Either way, we need to be able to remove the rotor. Currently, we have our caliper mounting bracket that is going over the rotor. We need to remove that so that we can gain access and remove the rotor itself. Taking a look towards the back of the rotor, we can see that there are two bolts that are bolting on our caliper mounting bracket. Using a little metal protector by AMSOIL again, I'm going to coat the bolt because again it's been on here about 10 years. This time I will be using a 17mm wrench. Now that our caliper mounting bracket has been removed, the last thing that is holding the rotor on are the two factory screws that they put on during the assembly process. Now this rotor is still pretty stuck on there. I'm going to use AMSOIL's metal protector and coat all of the stud locations. I'm going to coat the center hub, those little screw holes, and also inside the rotor from the back side. Once that is soaked in, I'm going to take a rubber mallet and see if we can help break that free. If I do a visual inspection of the rotor, it appears to be in pretty good condition. However, when I feel the actual rotor itself, I can feel very small irregularities in the rotor. This tells me that the brake pads have worn into the rotor to some extent. The back side of the rotor, again, I can feel just very, very small irregularities in the rotor. I brought my rotors into my local auto parts store and they did determine that there was enough material on the rotor to be able to turn the rotors down rather than buy new ones. Now that our rotors have been turned, we are ready to reassemble everything back together. To prep everything for reinstallation, I'm first going to use AMSOIL's heavy duty metal protector and coat some of the metal surfaces. This will help reduce any corrosion in the future, and it acts as an undercoat for these metal components that get a lot of rain, salt, and road debris. Next, I need to thoroughly clean the rotor with AMSOIL's brake and parts cleaner. This is a professional strength product. It is also a chlorinated formula, and it does an excellent job of cleaning all brake components. And make sure you do both sides. Reinstallation is done in the opposite of how we took everything off, with a few exceptions. I'm going to start those hold down screws first and then tighten them down. With the rotor held in place, I'm going to use AMSOIL's brake parts cleaner again. And I'm going to do this on the back side as well. Now, rather than just reinstalling everything back on there, I'm going to be using AMSOIL's brake and parts cleaner to clean all of the components, and I'm going to be using a wire brush to help break up any of the gunk and grime that's built up on those components. Ideally, I want it as clean as I possibly can. Prior to installing the mounting bracket, I'm going to coat the threads of the bolts with AMSOIL's heavy-duty metal protector. And another light shot of AMSOIL's brake and parts cleaner. Our new brake pads did not come with a hardware kit, and our old hardware kit is still in good condition. So I'm going to clean the old hardware kit and reinstall it on my caliper mounting bracket. After that, we can position our brake pads in place. After that, we can shift our attention to the caliper. As the brake pads wear, the caliper piston moves outward, compensating for the wear on the brake pads themselves. So as the brake pads get smaller, the piston pushes out to compensate for those brake pads getting smaller. We need to reset the caliper piston by pushing it back in. Before I mess with the caliper piston, I first want to locate my brake fluid reservoir. On this particular vehicle, it is located behind the air filter assembly. It is important to note the amount of fluid that is in the brake fluid reservoir. If the fluid is too full, when we depress the piston, it is going to be pushing all of that brake fluid back through the lines into this reservoir. If this reservoir is too full, it will overflow all over our engine. You may need to take a turkey baster and remove some of the fluid. If your fluid level is somewhat low, as this one is, we should be all right where it will not overflow. To reset the caliper piston, I'm going to place one of my old brake pads in front of the piston, and I'm going to put a C-clamp or a hand clamp up against that brake pad. As I tighten my clamp, it will depress the caliper piston and reset that back to its original position. Once that piston has been depressed, we can reinstall the caliper. And then I can reinstall those caliper bolts. And a little more AMSOIL's brake and parts cleaner before I install the wheel. And when reinstalling the lug nuts, You also want to do this in a star-shaped pattern. Don't go around in a circle, and make sure you torque it to the correct specifications. The front pads on our driver's side has been completed. We can now do the passenger side of the vehicle. The operations are the exact same. After the passenger side has been completed, before you do anything with turning on the car or test driving it, you want to make sure and step on the brake pedal multiple times until it becomes firm. And what it will do is it will set the caliper pistons on both sides to accommodate the new brake pads. The last step is to test drive the vehicle and make sure everything sounds right and everything feels right with the brakes. To do this, I'm going to step on the brakes firmly several times as I slowly back up. If there's a problem with it, you will typically notice it at this point. After that, I'm going to drive it around the block a few times, and if everything sounds good, this repair is complete.